All right, so let's dive into something kind of fascinating, but I gotta admit, a little spooky too.
Oh, yeah.
Our relationship with death, I mean, with all our modern, what do they call them, advancements, I guess. Even with all that, it still feels like this big mystery.
Yeah, it is. It really is a universal experience, though, and humans have been trying to, understand it forever, basically, as long as we've been around.
Right, and for this deep dive, we're going deep into an essay, Why We're Afraid of the Dark. That's by Chase Moore.
Okay.
But it's not just about being afraid of the dark, though, is it? He's
Okay.
really looking at why death still has so much power over us, even in a world that's so different from the one our ancestors lived in.
You're right. What's so interesting about the essay is how Moore connects our modern anxieties about death back to those early humans.
Mm-hmm.
Death was a much more frequent visitor for them.
Oh, yeah, I bet.
Imagine, like, living in a time when seeing someone die, whether it's from an accident, disease, or even conflict, was just a regular part of life.
Wow, I can't even imagine. But Moore suggests that their beliefs about death were like all over the place, right?
Yeah.
Some saw it as an accident, others saw it as a transition to something else. I don't know. It really makes you wonder if maybe they understood something that we've kind of lost sight of.
That's a fascinating thought, isn't it?
Yeah.
But whether they feared death or revered death, they seem to share this common desire to control this unknown force.
Okay.
Early burial rituals, offerings to the dead, it all speaks to that deep human need to make sense of something that just feels so beyond our grasp.
So if we're still trying to control death, what does that even look like in our modern world?
Right.
Moore suggests that even though we might be less religious as a society now, death still demands ceremony.
Hmm.
He even quotes Milton Cohen, who says that even with all our advancements, rituals like wakes and funerals, they're still a big part of how we deal with death.
There's something to be said about the power of ritual, even in a secular world. Think about it. Those practices, even if they've evolved over time, they still provide us with a framework for, processing grief and loss.
Mm.
They offer a sense of order and community in the face of something that can feel utterly chaotic.
So is it like we're trying to create meaning where maybe there isn't any? Or at least not meaning we can easily comprehend?
It's possible,
Mm-hmm.
but it also speaks to our need for connection, for continuity.
Hmm.
We're social creatures, and death disrupts that in a very profound way. Rituals, in a sense, that kind of help us bridge that gap.
That makes me think about how Moore dives into the concept of the afterlife. It's not just a modern idea, is it?
No, not at all.
He talks about ancient civilizations like Greece and Egypt. I mean, they were obsessed with it.
Yes, and I think it's crucial to understand that the idea of an afterlife, in whatever form it takes, it serves a really powerful psychological function.
Okay.
It offers comfort. It allows us to imagine some kind of continuation, which lessens the fear of complete annihilation.
It's like even if we don't believe in the same specific afterlives as those ancient cultures, we're still drawn to the idea of something beyond this life, something that makes death, a little less terrifying.
Absolutely.
Oh,
And that need for comfort, that desire to make sense of the unknown, it all ties into this whole field of death anxiety research, which Moore explores in detail.
okay, so this is where it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
Moore cites the work of Lado and Stein, who break down death anxiety into these three components: cognitive, emotional, and behavioral.
Okay.
It's not just about being scared of dying, it's also about the fear of loss, the uncertainty of what happens next, and how we actually act in response to those fears.
Right.
What's fascinating is how those different aspects of death anxiety can actually manifest in our lives. Think about it. Have you ever found yourself trying to gain excessive control in certain situations, maybe as a way to push back against the ultimate lack of control we have over death?
That's a good point.
I think we've all probably experienced that in some way or another. Maybe it's overworking, maybe it's obsessing over our health, or maybe it's just avoiding talking about death altogether.
And that avoidance, as Moore points out, can be a big part of the problem.
Really?
It prevents us from having these honest conversations about death, from planning for our own mortality, and from fully appreciating the life we have right now.
So it's not about becoming obsessed with death, but about acknowledging it, understanding its role in our lives. I'm curious to hear more about how that plays out in different cultures and throughout history.
That's a great question, and that's where Moore's essay really shines. He doesn't just focus on the psychological aspects. He also dives into the cultural and historical dimensions of death anxiety. For example, did you know that in some cultures, death is seen as a much more integrated part of life? Something to be celebrated rather than feared?
Wow, I never thought about it that way. It seems like we're so focused on pushing death away that we forget it's a natural part of the cycle of life.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's why exploring these different perspectives is so important. It allows us to challenge our own assumptions
Yeah.
and to perhaps find new ways of relating to this universal experience.
It's fascinating how, like, these different cultural lenses really shape how we view death.
Oh, yeah.
Some cultures, like you said, they just embrace death as a natural part of life cycle. They have all these vibrant rituals that celebrate the deceased journey and help the living process their grief. It's a stark contrast to the more somber, death-denying approach that we often see in Western societies.
I guess it makes you wonder if our fear of death is as much a cultural thing as it is a biological instinct. Like maybe we're conditioned to fear it more than we would naturally.
That's definitely something to think about. And that brings us to another point that Moore raises about modern society. He argues that even though we're becoming less religious, we're still searching for meaning and purpose, maybe even more so in the face of our mortality. Okay, so how does that search for meaning manifest itself, especially when it comes to death? Moore mentions some interesting examples of newer rituals and practices,
Yes.
right?
Yeah, he does. Think about the rise of green burials, for instance. It's not just about being environmentally conscious. It's also about returning to a more natural way of dying. One that's less focused on preserving the body and more about rejoining the cycle of life and decomposition.
It's like we're trying to redefine what it means to die to find ways to honor the dead that feel more aligned with our modern values and beliefs.
Exactly. And those changing values are also reflected in the growing popularity of life celebration memorials, where the focus is on sharing happy memories and celebrating the person's life rather than dwelling on the sadness of their passing.
Yeah, it seems like we're moving away from the traditional somber funeral and towards something that feels more personalized, more about the individual and how they lived their life.
That's a great observation, and I think it speaks to a broader cultural shift towards individuality and personal expression, even in death. We're no longer content with those one-size-fits-all rituals. We want something that feels authentic and meaningful to us.
Speaking of meaning, I remember Moore also discusses how our fear of death can manifest in these self-related behaviors, almost like we're trying to outrun our mortality.
Right. He cites the work of Casalino and his colleagues, who found that people might engage in all sorts of behaviors to avoid confronting their fear of death, from seeking excessive control to immersing themselves in work or hobbies that provide a sense of purpose and distract them from that existential dread.
It's almost like we're building these elaborate defenses against the reality of our own mortality.
In a way, yes.
Yeah.
But what's interesting is that these behaviors, while understandable, can actually backfire.
Mm.
The more we try to suppress or deny our fear of death, the more it can control us from the shadows.
So if running away isn't the answer, then what is? How do we deal with this fear in a healthy, productive way?
That's where I think the essay's message really resonates. It's not about erasing our fear of death completely, but about acknowledging it, understanding it, and using that awareness to live more intentionally.
So it's about accepting that death is a part of life, not something to be feared or denied, but something to be integrated into our understanding of ourselves and the world.
Exactly. And that acceptance, paradoxically, can be incredibly liberating. When we stop running from death, we can start embracing life more fully. We can start asking ourselves those big questions about meaning and purpose, about what truly matters to us, and how we want to spend the precious time we have.
I'm really struck by this idea of using our awareness of death as a catalyst for living a more meaningful life. It's almost like a wake-up call reminding us that our time is finite and that we should make the most of every moment.
It is. And that's where art, literature, and other forms of creative expression can play such a powerful role. Think about all the great works of art that have grappled with themes of mortality, from ancient Greek tragedies to modern-day films and novels.
It's like they're giving us a language to talk about something that's often taboo, something we struggle to put into words. They offer different perspectives on death, exploring its complexities and helping us make sense of our own feelings.
And they remind us that we're not alone in our fears and anxieties. Death is a universal experience. And by engaging with these works of art, we can connect with others who have walked this path before us and find solace in their wisdom and insights.
It's interesting to consider how technology is playing a role in this as well. Digital memorials, virtual cemeteries. It's like we're finding new ways to remember and honor the dead in the digital age.
Yeah, we are.
Yeah.
And while some might view these developments with skepticism, I think they reflect a genuine desire to keep our loved ones' memories alive, even in a world that's increasingly digital. They offer new avenues for expressing grief and finding connection, which can be especially valuable for those who are geographically dispersed or have limited access to traditional forms of memorialization.
It seems like we're constantly finding new ways to navigate our relationship with death, even as technology and cultural norms continue to evolve.
That's right. And it's important to remember that there's no one right way to approach this topic. What matters is finding what feels authentic and meaningful to you, whether it's through traditional rituals, creative expression, engaging with different cultural perspectives, or exploring the possibilities offered by technology.
I'm also curious about how advancements in medical technology are changing the way we die. Life-prolonging treatments, palliative care. These innovations give us more options, but they also raise some difficult questions.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
We have more control than ever over the end-of-life experience. But that control also comes with the responsibility to make informed decisions that are aligned with our values and wishes. It forces us to confront those big questions about what constitutes a good death, how far we should go to prolong life, and what it means to die with dignity in an age of medical advancements.
These are definitely complex issues, and I appreciate how Moore doesn't shy away from the ethical and philosophical dilemmas surrounding death and dying. He encourages us to have those tough conversations both with ourselves and with our loved ones so that we can approach these challenges with more clarity and compassion.
He does, and I think that's a crucial takeaway from this deep dive. It's not enough to simply acknowledge our fear of death. We need to engage with it actively, thoughtfully, and compassionately.
So it's not just about understanding death intellectually, but about exploring its emotional, ethical, and even spiritual dimensions.
Precisely. It's about recognizing that death is not some distant abstraction, but an integral part of the human experience, one that shapes our lives in profound and often unexpected ways.
You know, it's amazing how this one essay has really opened up so many different avenues of thought. I'm especially struck by how Moore connects our fear of death to this deep-seated need for control.
Yeah, it's a fascinating link, isn't it? And it makes me wonder, if in a strange way, our modern world, despite all its advancements, might actually be amplifying that need for control and in turn our fear of death.
Okay, I'm intrigued. How so?
Well, just think about it for a second. We live in a society that's obsessed with optimization, efficiency, predictability.
Yeah.
We have apps to track our sleep, our steps, our calorie intake. We're constantly trying to exert control over every aspect of our lives.
Right.
But death, like we've been talking about, is the ultimate unknown. It's the one thing we just can't schedule or quantify or optimize.
It's like this big wrench, just thrown into our carefully crafted plans, a stark reminder that ultimately we're not in control.
Exactly. And that clash, that fundamental disconnect between our desire for control and just the inherent uncertainty of death, it creates so much anxiety. It's like we're trying to build these walls of control to keep death at bay, but those walls are ultimately futile.
So what's the alternative then? If we can't control death, how do we make peace with it?
That's where I think a certain degree of surrender comes in. Not in a passive or resigned way, but in a way that acknowledges the limits of our control and allows us to find a sense of peace within that uncertainty.
It's like learning to let go of the illusion of control and embracing the unknown, the mystery of what lies beyond. It's definitely a shift in perspective, a different way of relating to life and death.
It is. And that shift might involve accepting that there are some questions that we'll just never have definitive answers to. There will always be a certain degree of mystery surrounding death, and perhaps that's okay.
Yeah, it's a humbling thought, isn't it? Especially in a culture that values knowledge and certainty above all else.
It is humbling, but there's also a certain beauty in embracing mystery. It allows us to approach life with a sense of wonder, awe, and humility. It reminds us that we don't have all the answers, and that's okay.
I love that. It's like by letting go of our need to control everything, we open ourselves up to a deeper, more nuanced understanding of life and death.
Exactly. And that understanding, like Moore suggests, can be the key to unlocking a more meaningful and fulfilling existence. Instead of seeing death as the enemy, as something to be feared and avoided, what if we saw it as a teacher, a guide, a constant reminder of the preciousness of life?
That's such a powerful reframing. It's like death, in its own paradoxical way, can teach us how to truly live.
I believe it can. It can help us prioritize what truly matters, to appreciate the beauty of the present moment, and to live with more intention and gratitude.
Well, this deep dive has definitely given me a lot to think about. It's amazing how exploring our relationship with death can ultimately lead us to a deeper appreciation for life.
Yeah, it is remarkable, isn't it? And it's a journey worth taking, even if it's uncomfortable at times. Because in confronting our fears, in exploring the unknown, we might just discover what it truly means to be human.
I think that's a perfect note to end on. This has been an incredibly thought-provoking conversation, and I'm so grateful for your insights.
Oh, the pleasure was all mine. I hope this deep dive has sparked some new ideas for you and encouraged you to continue exploring this fascinating and ever-evolving relationship we have with death.
It certainly has. And to our listener, I'd like to leave you with this. If the fear of death is so deeply ingrained in us, what if, instead of trying to erase it, we learn to harness its energy, to use it as fuel for living more fully, more authentically, more intentionally? It's a question worth pondering, a challenge worth embracing.